After months of sleepless nights, back-to-back investor calls, and more coffee than any human should reasonably consume, she finally did it. The deal was signed, sealed, and delivered. Her company, a small but fiercely innovative tech startup she'd built from her kitchen table, had just been acquired for a sum that made even her most optimistic projections look shy. She wasn't just celebrating a win. She was stepping into a new chapter, one where her name would no longer be whispered in pitch meetings but spoken with respect in boardrooms across the country. She treated herself to a first-class ticket home, not because she needed the luxury. She'd flown coach for years, even after the company started turning a profit, but because today felt different. Today she deserved to lean back, close her eyes, and let someone else worry about the details for once. The flight was from Atlanta to San Francisco, a route she'd taken dozens of times before, usually with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a protein bar in her pocket. This time she carried only a slim leather portfolio, her phone, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd earned every inch of this moment. The airport buzzed with its usual rhythm, rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, the occasional child's laugh cutting through the hum. She moved through security with practiced ease, flashing her boarding pass like a badge she'd finally earned. At the gate, first-class passengers were already being called. She stepped forward, heart steady, shoulders relaxed. For once, she wasn't rushing to prove anything. She was just arriving. Boarding the plane felt like slipping into a quiet sanctuary. The cabin was hushed, the lighting soft. She scanned the seats looking for 1A, the window seat she'd specifically chosen so she could watch the clouds roll by and think about nothing for a few hours. But as she neared the front, her steps slowed. Someone was already in her seat. A man, maybe in his late 50s, sat with one arm draped over the empty aisle seat, scrolling through his phone like he owned the space. He wore a crisp, button-down shirt and had the kind of calm confidence that comes from never being questioned. She paused, double-checked her boarding pass. 1A, window, first class, then approached gently. "Excuse me," she said, voice low but clear. "I think you're in my seat." He didn't look up right away, just kept tapping his screen as if her words were background noise. When he finally glanced at her, it was with the faintest flicker of annoyance, like she'd interrupted something important. He said, barely moving his lips. She held out her boarding pass, not aggressively, just enough for him to see. "This is 1A, that's my seat." He squinted at the pass, then at the seat number above him, then back at her. A beat passed. Then he shrugged. "Must be a mistake. I've been sitting here for 10 minutes. No one said anything. She didn't flinch. She'd heard versions of this before, in meetings where her ideas were ignored until a male colleague repeated them, in elevators where people assumed she was someone's assistant, not the founder. She knew how to stay calm when others expected her to shrink. "I don't think it's a mistake," she said evenly. "My ticket clearly says 1A, yours probably says something else." He sighed as if she were making his day harder. "Look, I just want to get settled. Can't you take another seat? There's plenty up here." She could have walked away, taken an aisle seat, avoided a scene, told herself it wasn't worth the hassle. But something in her resisted. Not out of pride, she wasn't trying to win a fight, but because this wasn't just about a seat. It was about being seen, about having her place acknowledged without having to argue for it. "I'd rather sit where I'm assigned," she said, holding his gaze. "If you check your ticket, I'm sure it'll show your real seat." Nearby, a flight attendant hovered, pretending to straighten a blanket, but clearly watching. Another passenger glanced over, then quickly looked away. The air thickened with unspoken tension, the kind that builds when everyone knows something's off, but no one wants to be the one to say it. The man finally stood, but not gracefully. He grabbed his bag with a sharp motion and muttered something under his breath as he stepped into the aisle. She didn't catch all of it, but the tone was unmistakable, dismissive, edged with something colder. She slid into her seat, her hands steady even as her pulse thrummed in her throat. She buckled her seatbelt, smoothed her blazer, and stared out the window, willing her breathing to slow. But the moment stayed with her. Not because of the man he was already forgotten, but because of how familiar it all felt. How even after everything she'd accomplished, the world still sometimes treated her like she was asking for too much just by showing up. She thought about the years of pitching her vision to skeptical investors who asked her if she really understood the tech side. She remembered the time a client assumed her co-founder was the CEO simply because he was a white man in a suit. She'd laughed it off then, but today she didn't feel like laughing. The cabin began to fill. People settled in, adjusted their headsets, flipped through magazines. Normalcy returned, but she felt anything but normal. She wasn't angry. Anger took too much energy, but she was tired. Tired of having to prove she belonged. Tired of the invisible ledger that tallied her worth against assumptions she never agreed to. Then, just as the last passengers boarded, the man from her seat reappeared. He wasn't heading to the back. Instead, he stopped a few rows up, exchanged a few words with another passenger, and laughed. Too loudly, too pointedly. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the tarmac, on the ground crew moving with quiet precision, on the way the late afternoon sun glinted off the wing. A flight attendant finally approached. "Everything all right, ma'am?" She nodded. "Just wanted my seat." The attendant gave a tight smile. "Of course. Enjoy your flight," but the unease lingered, because she knew deep in her bones that this wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about who gets to occupy space without question, who gets believed without proof, who gets to simply be without having to justify their presence. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself feel the weight of that truth, not as a burden, but as fuel. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its slow roll toward the runway, she closed her eyes. She wasn't going to let this moment steal her peace. She'd fought too hard, come too far, but she also knew something had shifted. Not in the world, maybe not yet, but in her. She wouldn't stay silent next time. Not because she wanted conflict, but because silence had cost her too much already. And then, just as the plane lifted off the ground, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Calm, professional, but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay. Please remain seated." She opened her eyes. Outside, the sky stretched wide and open. But inside the cabin, something was about to change. She'd learned long ago that raising her voice rarely changed minds. It usually just made people defensive. So she stayed quiet, sitting perfectly still in her window seat, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the clouds beginning to gather outside. But inside, her thoughts moved fast, like fingers flipping through a well-worn deck of memories. Every time she'd been talked over, every time someone assumed she was there to serve rather than lead, every time she'd smiled through a comment that stung because calling it out would make things awkward. She knew the cost of speaking up and the heavier cost of staying silent. The man who'd taken her seat was now somewhere in the back, but his presence lingered like a bad smell. A few rows ahead, two women whispered to each other, glancing in her direction. One looked sympathetic. The other quickly turned away when their eyes met. A man across the aisle pretended to read, but his book hadn't turned a page in 5 minutes. Everyone knew something had happened. No one knew what to do about it. Then came the mutter. Just loud enough to carry, just vague enough to deny. "Some people think a ticket buys them more than a seat." The words landed softly, but they hit hard. She didn't react, didn't flinch, but her stomach tightened. It wasn't the first time someone had implied she was too much, too confident, too direct, too unwilling to play small. In business, they called it ambition. In everyday life, especially when she was just trying to exist without explanation, they called it something else. A flight attendant finally approached, this one older with tired eyes and a practiced smile. "Is everything okay?" she asked, voice low. "I was assigned this seat," she replied, holding up her boarding pass again, not because she needed to prove it, but because she was tired of being doubted. "He was sitting here. His ticket says 12C. The attendant nodded slowly, then glanced toward the back of the plane. "I see. Let me get the gate supervisor." Minutes passed. The cabin grew warmer. The hum of the engines idled. Passengers shifted, checked watches, sighed. She stayed still, breathing deeply, reminding herself, this isn't about winning. It's about being treated like a person. When the supervisor arrived, a man in a crisp uniform with a name tag that read D. Reynolds, he looked flustered, like he'd been pulled from something more important. He took both boarding passes without making eye contact, scanned them with a handheld device, then frowned. He said. "There might have been a mix-up during boarding." "There wasn't," she said gently but firmly. "My pass says 1A, his says 12C. I just want to sit where I'm supposed to." He hesitated, looked at her, looked at the empty aisle seat beside her. Then, as if offering a compromise no one had asked for, he said, "Would you be open to switching to 1B?" It's the same row, just aisle. Might be more comfortable for the flight, she almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar. The suggestion that if she'd just be a little more flexible, a little less insistent, everything would go smoothly. As if her comfort mattered less than keeping the peace. I'd prefer my assigned seat, she said. I paid for it. I chose it, and I didn't do anything wrong. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat. I understand. But we're trying to avoid delays. If you're willing to move, we can get this sorted quickly. That's when it clicked. This wasn't really about the seat. It was about convenience. Her discomfort was an inconvenience. Her insistence on fairness was a disruption. And in the grand calculus of airline operations, disruptions were to be smoothed over, even if it meant asking the wronged party to yield. She thought about saying yes, just to end it, to sink into the leather seat and pretend none of this happened. But then she remembered the young woman who'd emailed her last month, saying she'd watched a panel interview and saw herself in her for the first time. She remembered the interns in her office who watched how she carried herself, how she spoke, how she held space. If she gave in now, what message did that send, not just to them, but to herself? No, she said, voice steady. I'm not moving. The supervisor's expression tightened. Not angry, just calculating. He glanced around as if weighing options. Then he gave a short nod. All right, I'll speak with the other passenger again. He walked away, shoulders stiff. She watched him go, heart pounding but resolve solid. She wasn't being difficult. She was being clear. And clarity, she'd learned, was often mistaken for confrontation, especially when it came from someone the world expected to be accommodating. Behind her, a child asked, Mommy, why is that lady sitting all alone up front? Shh, came the hushed reply. It's not our business, but it was everyone's business, wasn't it? How we treat each other in small moments, how we respond when someone's dignity is on the line, even if it's just over a seat on a plane. A few minutes later, the man returned, escorted by the supervisor. His face was red. He didn't look at her, just grabbed his bag from the overhead bin with sharp, jerky movements and muttered something about entitlement as he stomped past. This time she heard it clearly, and this time she didn't let it slide inside her like it used to. She let it hang in the air, exposed, ugly, and finally seen for what it was. She stayed in her seat, didn't gloat, didn't smile. Just sat there breathing, grounding herself in the truth. She belonged here. Not because of her title, not because of her bank account, but because she was a human being who'd followed the rules, paid her fare, and asked only for what was hers. The flight attendants began their final safety checks. Seatbelts clicked. Overhead bins snapped shut. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. Normalcy tried to return. But something had shifted. A woman in 2A caught her eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. An older man in 3C offered a quiet well done. Even the flight attendant who'd first approached her now moved with a different kind of respect, less performative, more real. She leaned her head back against the headrest. Outside, the sky darkened. The plane taxied toward the runway. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something deeper, clarity. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about the countless times she'd been made to feel like her presence was a request rather than a right. And today, for once, she hadn't apologized for taking up space. Just as the engines revved and the plane began its takeoff roll, the captain's voice cut through the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor delay due to a security concern. Please remain seated. The plane slowed, then stopped. Confused murmurs rippled through the cabin. She looked out the window. Ground crew were already approaching, radios in hand, faces serious. She didn't know it yet, but someone had spoken up. Someone had seen what happened and decided it wasn't not their business after all. And in that moment, a quiet act of courage from a stranger would ripple outward in ways no one expected. But for now, she just sat there, watching the tarmac lights blink in the dusk, feeling the weight of the day settle not as a burden, but as a beginning. The plane rolled to a stop. The low thrum of the engine softened to a quiet idle, and the cabin lights brightened slightly as if the aircraft itself had taken a breath. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances. A few pulled out their phones, scrolling for answers that weren't there yet. Someone near the back asked, "Are we turning around?" But no one answered. She stayed in her seat, hands resting lightly on her knees, watching through the window as ground crew in bright vests hurried toward the plane with purpose. Their movements were sharp, coordinated. This wasn't a routine delay. Something had triggered a protocol, and whatever it was serious enough to halt a fully boarded flight just minutes before takeoff. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, speaking softly to passengers, her expression calm but tight around the eyes. "We're working through a situation," she said when someone asked. "Please remain seated for now. No details. No timeline. Just waiting." She didn't panic. She'd learned early that panic clouds judgment, and judgment was all she'd ever had to rely on in rooms where no one looked like her. Instead, she observed, listened, noticed how the man who'd taken her seat now sat stiffly in 12C, arms crossed, jaw clenched, glancing toward the front every few seconds like he expected blame to land on him. And maybe, in some quiet part of himself, knew it should. Then a different voice came over the intercom, calmer than before but firmer. "Attention passengers. Due to a reported concern regarding onboard conduct and potential safety implications, we've been instructed by airline security to return to the gate. All passengers will need to deplane temporarily while we conduct a full review. We apologize for the inconvenience." A collective sigh rose through the cabin, groans, frustrated whispers. But beneath the annoyance, something else flickered. Curiosity, unease, even relief from those who'd witnessed the earlier exchange and felt the tension like static in the air. She finally understood. Someone had said something, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it couldn't be ignored. Maybe it was the woman in 2A who'd nodded at her. Maybe it was the man in 3C who'd murmured, "Well done." Or maybe it was the young guy in the middle seat who'd discreetly recorded part of the interaction, not to shame, but to document. Whatever it was, it had reached the right ears at the right time. As passengers began gathering their things, she stayed seated a moment longer, letting the reality settle. This wasn't about her anymore. It had become about accountability, about whether a quiet act of disrespect could be dismissed as just a misunderstanding when it carried the weight of something much older, much deeper. When she finally stood, she moved slowly, deliberately. No anger in her steps, no performance. Just the quiet certainty of someone who'd stopped apologizing for existing fully. Back in the terminal, chaos bloomed like spilled ink. Rebooking lines snaked past coffee kiosks and newsstands. Families huddled around charging stations, recalculating connections. Business travelers paced, phones pressed to their ears, voices tight with frustration. But amid the noise, a different kind of energy hummed, one of shared witness. A woman approached her near the gate area, eyes wide with something between admiration and disbelief. "I saw what happened," she said, voice low. "Thank you for not backing down." She just nodded. "I didn't do it for thanks. I just wanted to sit where I was supposed to." "But you made people see," the woman said. Really see. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she didn't. Instead, she found a quiet corner near a window and sat, watching planes taxi in the distance. Her phone buzzed, emails, texts, missed calls. One message stood out. A note from a colleague who'd seen a blurry clip circulating on social media. "Is this you?" People are talking. She didn't open the video. She didn't need to. She knew what it showed. Not a confrontation, but a refusal to disappear. Not a demand for special treatment, but a quiet insistence on equal treatment. Within the hour, news vans appeared outside the terminal. Reporters held microphones, scanning the crowd for a face. Airline staff moved quickly, ushering passengers toward alternate flights, issuing vouchers, offering bottled water like peace offerings. But the real action was happening behind closed doors, in security offices and corporate headquarters, in the quiet conversations between crew members who'd seen too many incidents brushed aside. She was asked to speak with a senior airline representative, a woman this time, mid-40s with a no-nonsense ponytail, and a voice that carried both authority and empathy. They sat in a small lounge away from the main chaos. "We take these reports extremely seriously," the woman said, leaning forward. "The passenger in question has been flagged in our system. We're reviewing whether to bar him from future flights, and we're also looking into how our staff handled the initial situation." She listened but didn't gloat. "I don't want him punished," she said after a pause. "I just want it to be clear that this kind of thing isn't okay. Not because of who I am, but because of what it says about who gets to feel safe, respected, and believed in public spaces." The airline rep nodded slowly. You're right, and you've helped us see a blind spot we didn't want to admit was there. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The flight she was supposed to be on remained grounded, its doors sealed, its passengers scattered. But something else had taken off, something harder to measure but far more lasting. As she waited for her rebooked flight, she thought about the ripple effect of one person choosing to speak up. Not with rage, not with spectacle, but with simple, unwavering truth. She thought about the flight attendant who finally called for help, the passenger who filed the report, the supervisor who, despite his initial hesitation, followed protocol once the stakes were clear. This wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning. And reckonings, she knew, were never clean or quick. But they were necessary. Her new boarding time was still hours away. She bought a coffee, found a quiet gate, and opened her portfolio. Not to work, but to write. Just a few lines in a small notebook she always carried. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is sit down. In the seat, that's yours. And as the airport buzzed around her, full of people rushing to get somewhere else, she finally let herself rest, not because the fight was over, but because she'd remembered her own worth, and that was enough for now. The days that followed felt like watching ripples spread across a pond, long after the stone had sunk. At first, it was just whispers, texts from friends, a few tagged posts on social media, a short clip shared in private group chats. But within 48 hours, the story had legs, not because anyone shouted it from rooftops, but because it resonated in that quiet, familiar way, the kind that makes people say, "I've been there," or "I saw that happen once and didn't know what to do." She didn't seek the spotlight. In fact, she avoided it. When reporters called, she declined interviews. When a popular podcast asked her to share her side, she politely said no. She wasn't trying to become a symbol. She just wanted her seat. But the world had other plans. What surprised her most wasn't the attention, it was the messages. Hundreds of them. From flight attendants who wrote, "We see this all the time and feel powerless." From young professionals who said, "I froze in a similar situation last month. Your calm gave me courage." From parents who told her they used the moment to talk to their kids about fairness, respect, and what it really means to mind your own business. One email stood out. It came from a woman who worked in airline operations, a supervisor, actually, who admitted she'd handled a nearly identical situation 2 years ago by asking the black passenger to just move to keep things smooth. She wrote, "I told myself I was being practical, but watching your video I realized I was being complicit. I've since spoken up in our training sessions. Thank you for making me see." That one made her pause, because it wasn't about blame, it was about awakening. And that, she realized, was the real power in what had happened. Not the grounding of a flight, not the policy review, but the quiet shift in people who finally saw how small choices add up to big injustices. Behind the scenes, the airline moved faster than anyone expected. The passenger who'd taken her seat was permanently banned from flying with them again, not just for refusing to move, but for the language he'd used afterward, which multiple witnesses confirmed carried a clear tone of racial condescension. The gate supervisor who'd suggested she take another seat for everyone's comfort was placed on administrative leave, pending a full review of customer service protocols. And within a week, the airline announced mandatory bias awareness training for all frontline staff, co-developed with an independent civil rights organization. She didn't ask for any of it, but she didn't dismiss it either. Because she knew change rarely comes from grand speeches. It comes from moments like this where ordinary people decide that the way things are isn't good enough. Then came the letter. Handwritten on thick cream paper, sealed in an envelope with the airline's official logo. Inside, the CEO apologized, not with corporate jargon, but with plain human words. "We failed you in that moment," it read. "And in failing you, we failed our own values. We're committed to doing better. Not just for you, but for every passenger who deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of how they look or where they sit." Along with the letter came an offer. Lifetime first-class upgrades on all their flights. She almost laughed. Not because it was excessive, but because it missed the point. She didn't want special treatment. She wanted equal treatment. But then an idea struck her, one that turned the gesture into something meaningful. She called the CEO's office directly. Not to refuse, but to negotiate. What if, she proposed, instead of just giving me upgrades, we partner on something bigger? What if every time I fly first class with you, a portion of that value goes toward funding STEM scholarships for young black girls? Not as charity, as investment. There was silence on the other end. Then slowly, a yes, absolutely. Within a month, the program was announced, not with fanfare but with quiet intention. 10 scholarships in the first year, mentorship opportunities, internships at her company. It wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about building something good from it. Meanwhile, life went on. She returned to her office, to her team, to the daily rhythm of running a growing business. But something had shifted in the way people looked at her, not with pity or admiration, but with a deeper kind of respect. Her leadership had always been respected for its results. Now it was respected for its integrity. At a company all-hands meeting, one of her engineers, a young woman who rarely spoke up, raised her hand during Q&A. After that flight, she said, voice trembling just slightly, I finally told my manager I deserved a promotion. I used your calm as my guide, and I got it. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Not for her, but because of her. And in that moment, she understood. Leadership isn't just about building companies. It's about modeling how to stand your ground without losing your humanity. She also heard from other CEOs, some supportive, others skeptical. One asked, wasn't it risky to make a scene? She replied simply, it wasn't a scene. It was a boundary. And boundaries aren't risky. They're necessary. Back home, she started saying no more often, not out of defiance, but self-respect. No to meetings that could have been emails. No to clients who expected her to work nights and weekends without regard for her time. No to the internal voice that still whispered, maybe you're asking for too much, because she never had been. Months later, she flew again, this time to speak at a leadership conference in Chicago. As she walked through the first-class cabin, her seat 1A waiting exactly as assigned, a flight attendant recognized her and smiled. Good to see you back, she said softly. And good to see you sitting where you belong, she smiled back. Thanks, it feels good to be here. But the real victory wasn't the seat. It was the peace she now carried, the quiet certainty that she didn't have to shrink to make others comfortable. That her presence was enough, that her truth mattered. And as the plane lifted into the sky, she thought not of the confrontation, but of the chain reaction it started. A passenger who spoke up, a crew that listened, a company that changed, a girl who now believed she could be a CEO too. That was the legacy she wanted. Not a viral moment, but a lasting ripple. One seat, one voice, one choice at a time. The Nairobi sun rose soft and golden over the city, painting the sky in warm streaks of amber and rose. She stood on the balcony of her hotel room, coffee in hand, watching the morning come alive. Vendors setting up carts, birds darting between rooftops, the distant hum of traffic beginning its daily song. In a few hours, she'd step onto a stage and speak to hundreds of young innovators from across Africa about building tech that serves people, not just profits. But right now, she was just breathing, just being. It had been nearly a year since that flight, the one that never left the ground, the one that somehow lifted so much more than itself. She hadn't planned for any of it, hadn't wanted the attention, the headlines, the weight of becoming the woman who got a flight, grounded. But time had a way of revealing meaning in moments you thought were just about inconvenience. She boarded her flight to Nairobi, in first class again, not because she needed to prove anything, but because it no longer felt like a luxury. It felt like a quiet affirmation. Her seat 1A waited for her. The flight attendant who greeted her at the door recognized her instantly, not from news clips, but from the scholarship program they'd launched together. One of our first recipients starts her internship next month, she whispered with a smile as she handed her a blanket. She's brilliant, she nodded, touched but not surprised. That was the thing about planting seeds. You didn't always get to see them sprout, but you trusted they would. The seat beside her stayed empty the whole flight. She didn't mind. In fact, she welcomed the space. It gave her room to think, to reflect, to let her mind wander back to that tense cabin in Atlanta, where everything had changed without a single shout or dramatic gesture. Just a woman asking for what was hers, just a group of strangers deciding that fairness mattered more than comfort. As the plane soared over the Atlantic, She thought about the messages she still received, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily. A teacher in Houston wrote that she used the story in her classroom to talk about dignity and everyday courage. A retired pilot emailed to say he'd spent 30 years in the cockpit and never realized how often bias played out in the aisles until he saw it laid bare. Even her own mother, usually sparing with praise, had said quietly over dinner one night, "You handled that like your grandmother would have. Firm, kind, and unshaken. That meant more than any headline." She also thought about the man who'd taken her seat. She never learned his name, and she didn't want to. Not out of bitterness, but because he'd become less a person and more a symbol of a system, one that assumes some people are entitled to space simply by existing, while others must earn it, prove it, fight for it. She hoped in some small way he'd reflected on what happened, not to shame him, but because real change begins when people see themselves clearly. Back home, the scholarship program had grown. What started as 10 spots had turned into 30, with plans to double again next year. Partner companies were lining up to offer internships. Parents wrote letters saying their daughters now believed they could build apps, lead teams, start companies. That was the real win. Not the apology letter, not the lifetime upgrades, but the quiet shift in what a young girl thought was possible for herself. At the tech summit in Nairobi, she didn't mention the flight in her keynote. She didn't need to. Instead, she talked about design with empathy, about building systems that include rather than exclude, about how innovation means nothing if it doesn't serve everyone, not just the loudest, the whitest, or the most familiar. After her talk, a group of young women approached her, eyes bright with questions and dreams. One asked, "How do you stay calm when people doubt you?" She smiled. "I remind myself that their doubt says more about them than it does about me, and then I keep going." Another asked, "What's the most powerful thing you've ever done?" She paused. "Sitting down," she said finally. "In the seat that was mine." They laughed, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. On her last night in Nairobi, she walked through a local market with a few new friends she'd made at the conference. The air smelled of grilled corn, spices, and rain-washed earth. Children ran between stalls, laughing. Music drifted from a nearby cafe. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely present. No past to carry, no future to chase. Just this moment, full and alive. Back on the plane home, as the cabin lights dimmed and passengers settled in for the long flight, she looked out at the endless sky. Clouds stretched in every direction, soft and unbroken. She thought about how small that moment on the tarmac had seemed at the time. A minor delay, a brief argument, a seat dispute. But sometimes the smallest cracks let in the most light. She hadn't set out to change an airline. She hadn't aimed to start a movement. She just wanted to sit where she belonged, without explanation, without performance, without having to prove she deserved it. And in doing that simple human thing, she'd reminded others that dignity isn't earned. It's inherent. The flight attendant came by with a warm towel and a quiet welcome back. She thanked her, then leaned her head against the window, eyes closing not from exhaustion, but peace, because she finally understood. The real victory wasn't in being seen. It was in no longer needing to be seen in order to feel whole. And as the plane carried her home, cutting through the night sky like a promise, she knew this truth would stay with her, not as a memory but as a compass, guiding her and maybe others too toward a world where everyone gets to sit in their seat, exactly as they are,